If you've ever played a game of Broken Telephone, you know how impossible it seems that a simple message can get so confused in just the course of a few people. Now imagine what can happen when the details of already strange and confusing disappearances are relayed over the course of decades. So, in this video, we're going to look at some of the most confusing disappearances in history. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On April 24, 1856, Joseph and George were about to enjoy a meal with their father, Samuel, in the family's modest cabin about 50 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Their mother, Susanna, was there too, but she was attending to chores while the boys ate. As Samuel and his sons were about to dig in, the family dog Sport began barking like he often did when something outside caught his attention. They all figured it was a squirrel or a fox or maybe a tasty rabbit, all of which were common in the area. Now, feeding a family was no easy matter in rural Pennsylvania in the 1850s, so Samuel grabbed his rifle and followed Sport outside to see if something edible was nearby. It's not clear whether he told Joseph and George to stay put or what Susanna was doing when he left, but the boys probably couldn't resist the urge to join the hunt and left without telling their mother. When Susanna finally noticed they were gone, she must have figured that they were with their father and that everyone would come back shortly. But then when Samuel came back, he assured her that the boys hadn't been with them and that he hadn't even seen them. Due to their ages and just generally how dangerous it was to be out in the wilderness for extended time, Samuel and Susanna began searching immediately, but despite scouring the area and calling the boys' names until their voices gave out, they got no reply. As nightfall approached, the situation became increasingly serious, and Samuel eventually ran to a neighbor's home and asked if they could spread the word that the boys were missing and that he and Susanna needed help. By some accounts, hundreds of eager searchers had materialized by the following morning, and other sources claim it was thousands. Whatever the number, some came from as far as 50 miles away. Again, this type of travel was no small feat in the 1850s, and the response shows just how tight-knit the community was and how determined the volunteers were to find the missing boys. Searchers teamed up in small groups and hacked their way through the forest from sunup to sundown, and then at the end of each long day, they prepared large fires and carried torches through the woods, yelling their names. But, unfortunately, their calls went unanswered, and with temperatures dropping drastically at night, it seemed unlikely that the boys would be found alive. Even so, the volunteers soldiered on and continually expanded the search area in case the boys were moving in the opposite direction. It's worth noting, however, that the search was limited to the west side of a creek near the family's cabin. The reason for this is that pretty much everyone agreed that the boys couldn't have crossed the creek without drowning because it was abnormally large that spring from all the snowmelt. So, the western shore of the creek itself was thoroughly searched, but the east side was ignored altogether. With the first frustrating week gone by and with nothing to show for it, some of the searchers began to suspect that there might be something that the parents weren't telling them. Some of them even went as far as to accuse Samuel and Susanna of harming their children and staging the disappearance to cover it up. Although this was just speculation and frustration, some searchers even began looking for newly dug and poorly concealed graves in and around the family's cabin. When these new searches turned up nothing, and as volunteers began returning to their homes and farms, it looked like neither the family nor the community would get any closure. More than a week after the disappearance, a Pennsylvania farmer named Jacob Dibbert was so frustrated by the search revealing nothing that he told his wife that he wished he could have a dream in which the boys' whereabouts would be revealed to him. Then, incredibly, on the night of May 2nd, he apparently did. In his dream, Jacob claimed he was walking along a quiet path in the woods when he crossed a log that had fallen over a creek. Then he came upon a dead deer and a child's shoe at the base of a damaged birch tree. He initially passed off as the product of his overactive imagination. After all, he'd been thinking about the dream before he actually had it. But as the story goes, Jacob then had nearly identical dreams over the following few nights, which he only told his wife about initially. Initially as well, though, he didn't really know what to make of these dreams. At the same time, though, it was just too weird to be having the exact same dream over and over with such specific details. Eventually, he told his brother-in-law about this dream, and incredibly, his brother-in-law recognized some of the landmarks Jacob was describing. Shortly afterward, the two set out to search the forest near the family's home to see if they could locate the items and landmarks that he'd dreamt about. Eventually, they reached the creek near the family's home, but like the other volunteers, Jacob's brother-in-law didn't think the boys could have crossed the creek. Jacob eventually convinced him that they had, and eventually the pair found the dead deer, the child's shoe, and the damaged birch tree on the other side of the creek where searchers hadn't looked. And tragically, nestled among the birch roots, they also found the bodies of Joseph and George nearly 2 weeks after they'd gone missing. Unsurprisingly, the remarkable sequence of events shifted suspicion from Samuel and Susanna onto Jacob. In fact, many people thought that this story was entirely made up and that he'd probably never had these dreams in the first place. And if he'd never had these dreams, the only way he could have known about the boys' location was if he'd been involved in their disappearance. But after autopsy, both children seemed to have died from exposure and there wasn't any evidence of foul play. As far as anyone could tell, they'd left the cabin to follow their father, crossed the creek, and then got hopelessly lost in the woods. Of course, it is possible that someone helped them cross the creek and then abandoned them on the other side, however unlikely. Whatever happened, the boys eventually became exhausted, lay down on the roots of the birch tree, fell asleep, and never woke up. In 1906, a small memorial was built to the site where the boys were found on land that's now part of Blue Knob State Park. Now, more than 150 years later, the story is still a permanent part of local lore, and the lost children of the Alleghenies probably won't be forgotten anytime soon. In late 1928, two young newlyweds set out on an epic rafting trip down the Green and Colorado rivers in the American Southwest. But their homemade boat was eventually discovered full of gear and in good condition near the Grand Canyon, but the couple was never seen again. Now, nearly a century later, the disappearance of Glenn and Bessie Hyde is still shrouded in myth and controversy. Glenn Hyde was born in Twin Falls, Idaho on December 9, 1898. Growing up, he and his family rafted some of the wildest rivers in western Canada and the United States. Glenn's love for adventure and all things outdoors grew steadily, and while he was still a teenager, he and his younger sister Jean piloted a sweep scow, which is a type of wooden boat, from the Salmon River in Idaho all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Glenn's future wife Bessie was born nearly 2,000 miles away in Parkersburg, West Virginia on December 29, 1905, and unlike Glenn, growing up, she preferred poetry and acting. Then, after graduating high school, she ran off with her childhood sweetheart and got married. Unfortunately, the marriage ended pretty quickly after it started, but her husband refused to grant Bessie a divorce. Undeterred by this, she wasn't about to let a failed marriage get in the way for her plans for the future, and so shortly after, she moved to San Francisco and enrolled at the California School of Fine Art. By then, Glenn was also in California, and the two met and fell in love on board a ship traveling between San Francisco and Los Angeles in 1927. Fairly quickly into the relationship, the young couple was already talking about marriage, but by then, Bessie's husband still refused to grant her divorce. So to expedite the process, she moved to Nevada, established residency, and took advantage of the state's divorce-friendly laws. Then, finally, as a free woman once again, Glenn and Bessie got married in Twin Falls, Idaho on April 10, 1928, the day after her divorce was finalized. Soon after that, they decided to spend their honeymoon rafting down the Colorado River after reading reports of a film crew that had recently been rescued while making a similar rafting trip through the Grand Canyon. By the late 20s, less than 50 people had managed to travel the full length of the Grand Canyon by boat, and of those who had, all were men. With Glenn's experience and Bessie's energy, they reasoned that they had as good of a chance of succeeding as anyone else. After all, Glenn was eager to establish himself as an outdoorsman, and family and friends described Bessie as an ambitious young woman out to make a name for herself any way she could. If they succeeded, Bessie would be the first woman to complete the trip, and with a little luck, they might even set a new record for the fastest trip through the Grand Canyon and become national sensations overnight. To give them the best chance possible, Glenn decided to build his own flat-bottom scow, just like the ones he'd used on previous trips throughout Canada and the Pacific Northwest. Known for their stability in rough, rocky, and shallow water, the scow was the perfect boat to navigate the turbulent waters of the Green and Colorado rivers in Utah, Arizona, and California. Glenn spent about $50 and 2 days building the boat, which he promptly named Rain in the Face. Then on October 20th, 1928, friends and family members gathered to see the couple off. According to those who showed up, Bessie seemed nervous and tentative about the upcoming journey, but excited nonetheless. And then, her and Glenn pushed the 20-foot scow into the water at Green River, Utah, and drifted away from the shore. They estimated that from their starting point, the trip would take about 6 weeks to their final destination, which was Needles, California. Their gear included journals, clothes, food, and a gun, but incredibly, no life jackets because Glenn considered them to be an unnecessary extravagance. Over the following weeks, he and Bessie successfully navigated a number of dangerous rapids and made contact with 3 different groups of people. The first meeting was with a riverman who was immediately concerned that they didn't have life jackets. He also told them that he didn't think their scow would even make it through the Grand Canyon, let alone the full distance to Needles. But, despite his warnings, Glenn and Bessie arrived at Bright Angel Creek in the Grand Canyon on November 16th. By then, they'd been on the water for nearly a month, but had only completed about half of their trip instead of 2/3 like they thought they would. The next people they ran into were while hiking up the Bright Angel Trail, and were 2 brothers named Emery and Ellsworth Kolb, who owned a renowned photography studio on the canyon's south rim. Emery introduced Glenn and Bessie to his family and gave them some supplies and gave them a quick tour of his studio, but like the old riverman, he told them that he didn't think their boat would make it the rest of the way and that they'd be better off spending the winter with him and his family. Glenn ultimately declined the offer, but the family later said that Bessie seemed tense and looked almost though she wanted to accept their offer. Upon seeing Emery's daughter all dressed up for the occasion as well, apparently Bessie even wondered aloud whether she'd ever get to wear such pretty shoes again. But despite Bessie's hesitance and strange comment, she and Glenn said and continued on. A day later, they met a wealthy California man named Sutro near the Grand Canyon Village. He would end up asking to join them, and Glenn agreed to take him as far as an area known as Hermit Rapids. The three of them arrived on schedule the following day, but by then, Sutro was shaken, happy to just be alive. The boat ride was apparently much rougher than he was expecting. In addition to that, after experiencing some of the Colorado River's most dangerous waters, he also said that Bessie seemed nervous and out of her element while Glenn had trouble handling the heavy boat. Then on top of that, Sutro also noticed that the couple didn't seem to adequately secure the scow at night, meaning that he was worried that it could come loose and drift away. All things considered, he thought it was a miracle that they'd even gotten as far as they had. Eventually, the three of them parted ways, and after Sutro said goodbye at Hermit Camp, Glenn and Bessie were entirely on their own. Unfortunately, not much is known about this portion of their trip. It wasn't until 2 weeks later on December 6th, when they didn't arrive in Needles, that Glenn's father officially alerted the authorities that the couple was missing. Right away, Glenn's father rounded up volunteers and launched a number of river searches over the next few days. He also hired Native American trackers and even convinced Secretary of War Dwight Davis to authorize the use of military aircraft in the search. For nearly 2 weeks, there wasn't a single trace of the couple until December 19th, airmen spotted the scow floating in a shallow pool at mile 237. There was still no sign of Glenn and Bessie, but the news did bring fresh hope they might eventually be found alive and well. Glenn's father and the Cole brothers set out to Peach Springs, Arizona to launch another search party that would make its way to the scow. The Cole brothers and a number of volunteers left a few days later and reached mile 237 on Christmas morning. All they found, though, was the scow floating just where the pilot said it would be. The boat's bow line had snagged on something in the shallow section of the river, keeping it in place, but it was unclear how long it had been there. The boat was also intact, and the couple's gear was neatly stowed and secured inside. Weirdly, there were no signs of an accident or foul play, and Bessie had made the last entry into her diary on November 30th with no indication of anything wrong. After removing as much gear from the scow as they could take with them, Emery ordered the boat to be cut free to continue floating down the river. Later, he was criticized for this, as further investigation may have revealed more about the missing couple. Some saw this as a careless act, while others considered it to be downright suspicious. Back in Peach Springs, Emery showed Glenn's father the gear they'd recovered, told him that he thought that whatever had happened, it was clear that Glenn and Bessie didn't leave the boat intentionally. Searchers then spent another month combing the canyons around Diamond Creek with no luck, and then Glenn's father returned the following year too, but Glenn and Bessie were never seen again. The weirdest thing about their disappearance, though, is that by the time they disappeared, the couple had already made it through some of the Colorado River's most infamous stretches. It would be weird for them to have made it through those sections, but not some of the easier later sections. At the same time, however, many experienced rafters suspect that the scow might have slammed into a boulder just below the surface in an area where the current was particularly strong. If they'd been going fast enough and had been caught off guard, the impact could have thrown Glenn and Bessie from the boat. Then, in the frigid water without life jackets, they could have quickly drowned before making it to shore. Another theory is that it's possible that the scow had come loose from its tether and drifted into the current when they stopped on the shore to prepare a meal or sleep for the night. This seems fairly likely as well, because Sutro noted that they didn't take adequate care in securing the boat the night he spent with them on the river. Then, if it did drift away, they might have been stranded with unclimbable cliffs on either side and unswimmable ice-cold water to every other side. In addition to these theories about some sort of accident, a number of more sinister theories began emerging almost immediately after the disappearance. The first was that Bessie had had enough of her domineering new husband by the time they'd reached the Grand Canyon, and that she decided to kill him, hike out, and then start a new life under a new alias. For a while, this seemed pretty far-fetched, but things took an interesting turn one evening in 1971 around a campfire at Diamond Creek. After a long day on the river with fellow rafters, an elderly woman announced that she was Bessie Hyde and that she'd stabbed her abusive and overbearing husband, concealed his body, and then hiked out of the canyon on her own all the way back in 1928. However, upon further investigation, birth records showed that she was born in Ohio and Elizabeth Cutler was her real name. This seemed to put an end to the idea that Bessie had harmed Glenn. The case then took another twist when one of the brothers, Emery Culp, died in 1976. Friends going through his boathouse the following year discovered a skeleton with a bullet hole in its skull. It was eventually sent to a forensic anthropologist who determined that it was from a tall Caucasian male who probably died in his 20s, which matched Glenn's description. In addition, the .32 caliber bullet rattling around inside the skull was fired from a revolver manufactured around the turn of the 20th century. It was ultimately ruled that the skeleton wasn't Glenn's, but not everybody was so sure that such a definitive determination could be made, especially with forensic DNA testing not available yet. Either way, the skeleton sparked rumors that Emery Kolb had become smitten or maybe even infatuated with Bessie during the short visit to the Grand Canyon, and that he'd killed Glenn out of sheer jealousy. Again, this seems fairly far-fetched, and detractors have also pointed out that Emery Kolb had served as a representative for the local coroner. It would be incredibly strange, but it's at least possible that he took an unclaimed skeleton home as a souvenir, and that was the one that was found. The final weird possible lead came in 1992 when a well-known Colorado River rafting guide named Georgie White became a person of interest. Shortly after her death, friends going through her belongings discovered a revolver, a copy of Glenn and Bessie's marriage certificate, and a birth certificate showing that her real name was Bessie DeRoss. Although her family name was different from Bessie's, it added even more to the conspiracy fire. At the very least, her name was an odd coincidence, and the marriage certificate was even more strange. It also begs the question, why would a river guide need an alias? In any case, whoever she really was, photographs of her as a middle-aged woman and those of Bessie as a young woman do look kind of similar. But ultimately, although the mystery has been featured in dozens of articles, books, and podcasts, we'll probably never know exactly what happened to Glenn and Bessie Hyde. By 1945, the Sodders were a well-respected family of first-generation Italian Americans. The head of their family and father, Giorgio Soddu, immigrated to the US at just 13 years old and quickly changed his name to George Sodder. An older brother accompanied him as well, but only as far as Ellis Island before the two went their separate ways. After arriving in the US, George quickly found work as a railroad laborer in Pennsylvania and eventually moved to West Virginia and founded a successful trucking company. Then, in the early 1920s, he met a young woman named Jenny Capriani, who'd also been born in Italy. The couple got married 3 years later in 1923 and then moved to Fayetteville, West Virginia, put down roots, and got down to business starting a family. By all accounts, George was a good father, husband, and provider, but he also had strong opinions about politics and current events, and his views didn't always sit well with other Italian Americans in the town, especially with some of the tumultuous and controversial things occurring across the Atlantic before and during World War II. On the night of December 24th, 1945, George, Jenny, and 9 of their 10 children shared a meal before opening a few presents in celebration of Christmas Eve. After dinner and presents, the family went to bed like any other ordinary evening. Around midnight, the telephone rang and Jenny thought it might be her son who was in the army calling to wish everyone Merry Christmas. But when she answered, the voice on the other end of the line belonged to a strange woman who asked Jenny if she could speak to someone she didn't know. Because of the laughter in the background of the call, Jenny assumed that the woman was at a Christmas party and had dialed the wrong number after one too many drinks. Before returning to the first-floor master bedroom, Jenny noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains hadn't been drawn and that the front door was unlocked. Since one of their children, Marion, was the only one asleep on the living room couch, she figured the other children were already upstairs in bed. So she closed the curtains, locked the door, turned out the lights, and returned to her own bed. Shortly after dozing off, she thought she heard something heavy hit and roll off the roof. But in that in-between between waking up and sleeping, it didn't really register how weird that was, so she fell right back asleep after hearing the noise. About 30 minutes later, she was woken up again, but this time by heavy smoke filling their bedroom. George woke up a few seconds later, and already they could barely see or breathe. Since the fire had already swept through the downstairs, they grabbed 2-year-old Sylvia from the crib next to their bed and then ran out of the house. 3 of their kids, 16-year-old George Jr., 17-year-old Marion, and 23-year-old John, were already outside, but 6-year-old Dolly, 8-year-old Jenny, 10-year-old Louis, 12-year-old Martha, and 14-year-old Maurice were not outside yet. George immediately ran back to the house and shattered a downstairs window. He then jumped through the window into the inferno, only to find that the flaming staircase was completely impassable. Next, he ran to the side of the house for the ladder so he could use it to rescue his children through a second-floor window, but the ladder was not where he'd last seen it. Next, he tried to drive one of his coal trucks up to the house and enter a second-floor window from the top of the cab, but both trucks wouldn't start, even though they'd been working perfectly the day before. In all of the chaos, Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but no one picked up the call. Another neighbor also saw the blaze and called too, but again, no one answered. This same distraught neighbor eventually drove into town and tracked down the fire chief, but even though the firehouse was less than 3 miles away, by the time the crew showed up approximately 6 hours later, the home had been reduced to ashes. George, Jenny, and the rest of the children could only watch as they could only assume that the rest of the family was still inside the home. As devastating as this was, though, and weirdly, almost immediately after the fire was finished, they began to have doubts about whether the children were even inside. After searching the rubble, no remains were discovered anywhere. Not even the skeletons were recovered, which is typical in house fires. To top it off, the house had only burned for about an hour, and even the fire chief admitted that it probably hadn't been hot enough to fully cremate 5 bodies. Shortly afterward, a state police investigator stated that the fire was due to faulty wiring, but later, an independent electrician hired by the family discovered that some of the home's electrical wires had been cut before the fire. Unfortunately, they had no idea when they were cut or by who. Then, despite these odd inconsistencies, authorities ruled the fire accidental, and the 5 death certificates issued before the new year all stated that the missing children had died in the fire that night. Tragically, if remains had been found, George and Jenny could have had some closure and started putting their broken family back together. Instead, they became increasingly convinced that their children had not been inside the home when the fire occurred, that they might be alive somewhere still, and that the fire may have been used to cover up a kidnapping. With few options at their disposal, they rented a huge billboard on Route 16 with the names and faces of the missing children, along with a promise to pay $5,000 to anyone with information about their whereabouts. At the same time, Jenny began testing to see if bones actually burn in fires by burning various animal bones to see if she could turn them into ash. And what she found was that no matter how hot the fire got or how long the bones burned, they always remained intact. Jenny even contacted a crematorium and was told that bone fragments often remain, even after incineration, for 2 hours or more at 2,000 degrees. House fires can get that hot, but it's still different than direct exposure for 2 straight hours. So, with half of his family dead or missing and far more questions than answers, George tried to preserve the site by filling the basement and foundation with more than 5 feet of dirt. Rather than feeling more confident about the circumstances, the family began to remember a number of strange events that occurred before December 24th, and these are some seriously strange and confusing events. The first involved a stranger who'd shown up at the house looking for work a few months before. The man had walked to the back of the house, pointed to a fuse box, and said it would probably start a fire someday. George thought it was particularly strange behavior since a local utility company representative had just given the home's electrical system a clean bill of health. At about the same time, a traveling insurance salesman stopped by the Sodder home and had become enraged when George declined to purchase a policy. Strangely as well, he also predicted the house would go up in smoke, that it would destroy George's children, and that he wouldn't get away with criticizing Italian dictator Mussolini. George was known to not be shy about voicing his dislike of Mussolini, but at the time, he chalked it up to nothing more than a threat made by a frustrated insurance salesman with a big mouth. In another instance, the Sodders' oldest son, Maurice, also remembered seeing a mysterious man in a car parked down the road watching the younger children walk from home to school. But things got even stranger when the Sodders found a charred object in the debris that seemed to resemble a pineapple bomb hand grenade, similar to the ones used by American servicemen in World War II. Upon seeing this object, Jenny recalled hearing the thud on the roof the night of the fire and wondered if it had been caused by this object. In addition to that, there were also a number of odd sightings reported of the missing children after the incident. The first came from a woman who said she'd saw the missing children gazing from the window of a passing car while the Sodders' house was still burning. Another woman said she served the Sodder kids breakfast on Christmas morning at a roadside restaurant near Charleston, West Virginia. Another said 4 of the missing children stayed at a hotel in Charleston about a month after the fire, and they were accompanied by 2 stern men of Italian descent driving a car with out-of-state plates. The receptionist apparently tried to engage the children in conversation, but after a short burst of Italian from one of the men, the children stopped talking. One time as well, George even thought he saw his missing daughter Betty in a newspaper photo of school children in New York City. He drove to Manhattan and apparently located the family, but the girl's parents refused to even speak with him. Shortly after that, a letter arrived from a woman in Missouri who claimed one of the children, Martha, was in a convent in St. Louis. Another tip came from Texas, where a bar patron said he overheard a conversation between 2 men where they were discussing a mysterious Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia years before. In the end, George would follow up on dozens of these leads from across the country, but he always returned to West Virginia empty-handed. 2 years after the fire, the Sodders wrote to the director of FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, asking if he and the Bureau would get involved. He would get a reply, but unfortunately stated that the Bureau could only help if local authorities officially requested assistance. Unfortunately, the Fayetteville Fire and Police Departments weren't interested. Instead, the family ended up hiring a private detective named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley would go on to discover that the angry insurance salesman happened to be on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. He also learned that after the fire chief had found what appeared to be a human heart in the ruins of the Sodder home, but had buried it on site and kept the discovery to himself. After tracking him down, the pair dug up the organ in question and took it to a local mortician who determined that it was a cow's liver that had never been anywhere near a fire. Later, it was discovered that the fire chief had told others that he had bought the liver and buried it in hopes that they'd find it, accept it as proof that their missing children had died in the fire, and then call off their personal investigation. Then, nearly 5 years after the fire, the Sodders also hired a renowned Washington, D.C. pathologist to excavate the site and analyze any items that were recovered. The excavation revealed personal and household items, as well as a few small shards of what were later determined to be human vertebrae. These bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institute, where additional analysis revealed that they were relatively close in age to some of the missing children. However, they showed no evidence of ever being burned. The report also noted how it was odd that no other bones were found, and that in many house fires, whole skeletons are recovered intact. In the end, the report concluded that the bones weren't from the Sodder children and that they were probably in the dirt that George used to fill the foundation after the fire. These findings prompted 2 hearings at the Capitol in Charleston, but officials still refused to reopen or even re-examine the case. Then, in 1968, Jenny Sodder received a letter that had been postmarked in Kentucky. Inside, she found the photo of a young man with an uncanny resemblance to Lewis, who was just 9 years old on the night of the fire. On the back was a cryptic message that read, "Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ILI, boys, A90132 or 35. Despite their fears that publishing the letter might bring harm to the children, they did update the billboard on Route 16 with the new photograph. George then hired another private detective to follow up in the lead in Kentucky, but nothing else was found since the letter had no return address. It's also not even clear if the letter was legitimate or if it was just a prank on a desperate family. Tragically, George Sodder passed away in 1969, never knowing what happened to his missing children. Jenny died 2 decades later, and up until the time of her death, she wore black in mourning and remembrance. Now, even the billboard with the faces of the missing children is long gone, but George and Jenny's grandchildren haven't given up the search. Some theorize that the local mafia may have orchestrated the fire and kidnapping after George refused to pay extortion money, or that it was Mussolini loyalists who were retaliating for what they considered his unpatriotic political views. Whatever the case, George's political views, their children were kidnapped by the group of people who started the fire. Of course, though, it's also possible that they might have simply died in the fire after all. It's possible the fire burned far hotter than originally thought, and the bones really could have been reduced to ash. Unfortunately, because of how long ago the case occurred and how highly publicized it was, there are so many theories and conflicting accounts, it just makes it all that much more confusing. In any case, I know this case has been covered a bunch before, but since it's so infamous and since this is a new series, I figured it might be good to include. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching. This is part of a series, so you might want to check out the other videos in the series. If you want to support the channel, give this video a like, and if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the email found in the description or the Scary Interesting subreddit. And hopefully I will see you in the next one.